of necessity, resistance to the threat of extinction has to be grounded in nonviolence. The ultimate violence must be met by nonviolence. And historically, this is the case. The first act of nuclear resistance that I'm personally aware of was that of World War II conscientious objector Ben Anderson, who served time at a prison camp in California during the war. And when he heard about the Hiroshima bombing, he walked out of prison, printed up 5,000 copies of a leaflet against the atomic bomb, and hitchhiked across the country, fasted for several months, and began nonviolent resistance to nuclear weapons. We're fortunate to have a very strong connection with history here with us today in the man of Gordon Mayhem. Gordon Mayhem helped build Y-12. For that job, he had an exemption from the World War II draft. When Gordon found out really what that job he was doing led to, he quit. He was drafted after the war and served 3 years in prison as a conscientious objector after World War II. So this is the nonviolent root of our resistance. We're also fortunate in the 1950s, resistance to the bomb sort of then became organized. And one of the principles for organizing that resistance to the bomb in this country was Bradford Little, who we're also fortunate to have here with us this weekend. Bradford Little was the intellectual force behind the Committee for Nonviolent Action that organized the Omaha action that Frank Cordero spoke of. They also organized nonviolent direct action in Cheyenne, where another missile base was being constructed. The Polaris actions, which occurred in New England in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And these were the efforts of a small group of pacifists, many of them who had come out of the World War II experience as conscientious objectors, to carry forward in community, recognizing, and this is another lesson we have from the past, the value of community, the necessity of acting in unison with others, of sharing our ideas and our motivation and being part of a broader community than our own conscience, joining our conscience with others. A lot of the willingness to resist the state, and certainly that is what we are about. In the post-war world, it is the national security state that we confront. And that requires that sometimes we face prosecution, because that is the essence of the state. And if you challenge its foundation, you'll be criminalized. And that's why we end up here. But we have learned along the way that we even have probably the law on our side. The law is often used, however, practically, to evade justice. And so we are prosecuted rather than those who plan the end of the world, who are willing to poison communities for the sake of profit. Development of this idea that we are in fact correct in our opposition to nuclearism has led to an understanding that what we are engaged in is not always necessarily civil disobedience in the classical form where we violate an unjust law. Rather, we are violating and charged with violating laws when they are used to protect an injustice. The concept of civil resistance is that we are protecting the civility in society with our actions, rather than entering into a criminal sphere. Part of community also is international solidarity. An example of international solidarity is the campaign against the Euro missiles. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States wanted to bring tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, and they did in the form of Pershing and cruise missiles. And the Europeans were strongly objecting to that because they recognized that it made their country the target of retaliation and even a first strike, rather than the United States, who actually owned the weapons and controlled the weapons. And communities of resistance rose up at the bases where those missiles were deployed from, in England, in Italy, in Germany. In England particularly, the women at Greenham Common, in coordination with, again, a Nukewatch campaign, made the strategic advantage that the planners of war gave to cruise missiles, that they were mobile missile launchers that would move away from the base and blend into the community, and therefore would not be easily targeted by our opponents, by the Soviet Union, because they wouldn't know exactly where that missile was so that it could be struck first. The activity of the communities at Greenham Common and outside the Nukewatch campaign tracked every single mission that they went on to practice deploying and hiding into the English countryside. They followed it. They interfered with those convoys, they publicized their location, and they destroyed the strategic advantage of these mobile missile launchers to the point that they had no strategic advantage, and that led to their eventual withdrawal from Europe. They're not likely to give the movement credit, but I think we can if we look at it, practically from that strategic perspective. Sorry, but I had to juggle my notes a little bit here, and then my computer crashed. So. Another lesson we learned is that it has been throughout the nuclear age, when sort of the popular tide for eliminating nuclear weapons has receded. It has been the resistance that has kept alive the vision of disarmament, while much of the community has been placated by mere arms control or treaties that reduce the environmental risks, such as the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty that sort of trumped the Ban the Bomb movement by bringing that environmental threat underground and not into the atmosphere. But it was people like the Committee for Nonviolent Action that continued to say, no, the issue is the nuclear weapons and the solution is disarmament. But of course, through the 60s and the 70s, a lot of the social energy went into the anti-war movement in the United States, the civil rights movement. And then after the end of the war and with the many successes of the civil rights movement, that energy to resist had a chance to be nurtured by the nuclear resistors in the 70s. The Jonah House community was essential to that. The anti-nuclear power movement was inspired in this country much by anti-nuclear power movement in Europe, particularly in Germany. In the in the 1980s, of course, there was a broad-scale movement for, well, what was it for? Was it for disarmament or was it for arms control? Because its most popular expression was in the freeze, the nuclear freeze movement, which proposed for the liberal community that we simply stop making more, because at that point in time, the United States and Russia had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. Ronald Reagan was very astute, and he said we can do more than just freeze nuclear weapons, we can cut nuclear weapons, and we can construct a shield to protect us from our opponents who might use nuclear weapons against us. And this seemed to satisfy a lot of the movement and undercut the notion of simply freezing nuclear weapons. And so those who were satisfied that arms control was enough kind of faded from activism, and those who insisted on disarmament continued in that post-80s, early 90s period with Plowshare's actions and campaigns like here at Y12, at Ground Zero, and elsewhere around the country, continued to keep that notion of disarmament alive